So this brings us to our second plenary session, Iconic Species, Sharks, Birds, Elephants, and Buffalo. And to lead this panel, we're fortunate to have with us one of the nation's leading experts in this area, Dr. Deborah Popper. Besides her groundbreaking research on Buffalo Commons, Deborah is a professor at the College of Staten Island and at Princeton University. And she is the vice president of the American Geographical Society. Deborah, we're eager to hear from you and your panel.
Thank you, John, and it's wonderful to be here and for the third great symposium. This one is on animals, and since you are all animals, okay, we are all animals, I suggest we all stand up right now, reach across the table and shake hands with somebody, and get to know somebody else interested in Geography 2050. Okay, everybody, you're animals, but sit down, please. That's terrific. That's great. Okay. I know. That's exactly. I knew it. I knew it. All right. Here we go. Okay, thank you, everybody. That's great. And actually, the energy right there was terrific. Okay, now this session is on iconic species, and here is one. A buffalo, gorgeous buffalo, located at the slide taken on the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It is more properly called bison, but as an iconic species, it's probably called buffalo. Now, I see the role of this panel in the symposium is extremely important because understanding and thinking through our relationship with animals goes to very deep places in our psyches and our societies. As David Quammen wrote in Monster of God, for as long as Homo sapiens has been sapient, for much longer if you count the evolutionary wisdom in our genes, alpha predators have kept us acutely aware of our membership in the natural world. They've done it by reminding us that to them, we're just another flavor or meat. Now, those relationships, of course, have changed and continue to change. Our transformation, our conversion of the planet into our playground, otherwise known as this era of the Anthropocene, has meant and keeps promising devastation for many species. Extinctions of enormous magnitude, with estimates of a third of the sharks and rays, a fifth of reptiles, a sixth of birds, a quarter of the mammals, all headed for extinctions. And predators have long been especially vulnerable, all leading in turn to calls for protections and preservations or setting aside. But, and I think that I have to add to Chris's charge to you, the where, the how, the why, and the who should be responsible are all things that have to be answered as we think this through. What does it mean for the relationship with these animals and others? And that some of those relationships can be strange. So here, let's see, is this going to work? Help. There it is. Oh, did it come across? Can you see? There is another one of our gorgeous, iconic species, the dog. And let me introduce you to Man Ray, if you don't know Man Ray, William Wegman's long photographed Weimaraner. Now, but back to bison. Okay, I've been thinking about bison on the American Great Plains for a long time. In 1987, with my husband, Frank Popper, a planner at Rutgers, I published an article in Planning magazine titled The Great Plains from Dust to Dust that explored the boom and bust history of that region in the center of the country. and the triple pressures from population loss, economic decline, and environmental degradation. We imagined a potential future that we called the Buffalo Commons, a metaphor for a future of development that was lighter on the land and with restoration of native species as both the key component for thinking about it, and for those native species to serve, I suppose, in some form as guides or informants to how to think about inhabiting a place. Native grasses of the plains, buffalo grass, for example, little blue stem and big blue stem, with their deep roots, basically that go straight down, protect them certainly from the highly variable climate that the Great Plains has. But they also keep down, if you maintain them, soil erosion, and they themselves have enormous biomass. Bison used migratory strategies and had a much more varied diet than the cattle that replaced them. And with prairie dogs that they worked in concert with, if you will, they maintained the vitality of the soils, and the ecosystem. Now, the term Buffalo Commons was supposed to be suggestive, not prescriptive, with the word commons indicating that we are indeed all in this together. We chose buffalo for the first part because they are indeed iconic, then and now. And note that within the last year, the Congress made the buffalo our national mammal, with sponsorship, by the way, from both red and blue states. This is one of the things they could agree on and move forward on, too. The proclamation celebrating the return from near extinction at the end of the 19th century, and with thanks in truth, their return to the New York Zoological Society and its members back in that early part of the century, some of whose members, in fact, were shared with the American Geographical Society. Now, Frank's and my experience talking to people on the plains back in the 1980s and 1990s about buffalo, admitted that they were iconic, certainly. But often that admission was, yes, they were iconic as part of history, but not in the present. So in fact, there has been a change since the 90s in the ways in which we think of it, which I think is important. But at the time, and as we think through trying to figure out how to do restoration, I can tell you from my experience, it's not easy. Our term caught on, but it generated enormous anger, as well as some praise. And what we learned as we spent the next couple of decades wrestling the ideas we'd let loose was the power of the icon, but also its much more complex place in the ecosystem and in the social system. Bison work as icon, wildlife, and sustenance, each connoting maybe and requiring a different relationship and way of valuing. Brothers to the native tribes of the plains requiring consideration, but not isolation and setting apart. And indeed, if you want some very impressive shots at the moment, look at some of the footage coming from the water protectors at Standing Rock and the bison herds that are coming out and watching them as they protest the Dakota Access Pipeline. The relationship remains complex and uneasy in parts. Should they mainly be in parks and protected from hunting? What happens when they wander off? And we've certainly seen any number of negotiations over what happens in Yellowstone to the bison who wander into Montana from Yellowstone. Should they be on ranches eating the grasses in forbs, and as they are in this shot on, this is Wild Idea Bison Ranch, which in this case, they really are 100% grass-fed, or on farms and fed. What kind of social system should they be allowed to develop? What kind of breeding programs are legitimate? How much management should they get? Should they be dehorned and so that they don't hurt each other? How much change can they take? In my early Buffalo Commons sort of discussion days, I remember a very moving line from Fred Dubray of the Cheyenne River, Lakota, who at the time was the president of the Intertribal Bison Cooperative. And he was instrumental in bringing, bringing a lot of attention to this issue and stimulating the return of bison to numbers of the reservations. But as he began to undertake this particular project, he talked about how he had spoken with one of the elders. And what she said to him was, before you begin, you must ask the buffalo if they want to come back. So on with the wrestling, which is what we're doing here. So let me introduce my panel, who indeed I think will give us a lot of different perspectives on this. We will hear from Michael Steinberg, who's a professor at the University of Alabama, a geographer. His research is focused on the human dimensions of environmental conservation, sporting conservation, and conservation mapping in the tropical world. He is the author of Stalking the Ghost Bird, the Elusive Ivory-billed Woodpecker in Louisiana, and also Dangerous Harvest, Drug Plants and the Transformation of Indigenous Landscapes, among his other writings. He is also affiliated with the Snow Leopard Trust and the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. And he is my new best friend because he and I co-edit the new Digital Focus, and he is a fabulous co-editor with me. So I love Mike Steinberg, okay? Then, now, across from him is Ryan Orgera, right, let me pronounce it correctly. And he is the Pew Charitable Trust Senior Associate for Global Shark Conservation. And he is also the sole social science representative on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Federal Marine Protected Area Advisory Committee. Okay. He has worked on coastal issues, including as project manager with the New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium and the Urban Coast Institute of Monmouth University. And before that, he was a marine policy fellow in Senator Bill Nelson's office, where he worked on coral conservation, invasive species, flood insurance, coastal management, and all sorts of other things. And then in the middle is Meredith Gore, and she is the person who is spending the year at the State Department as the Jefferson Science Fellow. So at other times, she teaches at Michigan State University and interestingly, in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife and the School of Criminal Justice. And she is at the forefront of conservation criminology, an interdisciplinary field or approach and you've heard about it here first, right? That synthesizes natural resource policy, risk and decision analysis, human behavior, and crime science. Her leadership in this field has resulted in new scientific insights regarding conservation of species such as white sharks, lemurs, cranes, sea turtles, rhinos, elephants, plowshare tortoises, double-crested cormorants, black bears, and gray wolves. So let me turn the podium over to them and listen to what they have to say, put together your questions for them, everybody. All right.
Okay, thank you, Deborah, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this meeting. It's my first time here. I think when my invitation was offered, people expected me to talk about birds because I've written quite a bit about birds. But unfortunately, most of the birds I've written about are extinct or just about extinct, so I didn't think that was the best topic for a futuristic conference. So I'm going to return to a marine theme that we saw in the previous panel, and I want to I'll touch on a number of things that the previous panel touched on as well. So the title of my talk today is Sport Angling and the Future of Marine Protected Areas. I guess I can move this. I don't have to lean over. Whoops. So I'm not going to put up too Uh-oh. There we go. I'm not going to put up too much text, but I want to just put up a few things to sort of ground everybody in the topic that I'm talking about. We've seen an explosion of marine protected areas across the globe, and again, the previous panel alluded to some of this. But just a few numbers. In 1970, there were about 118 MPAs in 27 nations. By 1994, the number expanded tenfold to at least 1,306. Dozens of nations today, there are around 5,000. So that's it's been a really popular conservation tool in many parts of the world, and we've seen that in our own country with President Obama's declarations in the last year. Marine protected areas, or MPAs, have been lauded for their benefits to fisheries, including increases in larval supply from protected source populations. The idea is if you protect a discrete area, it will feed into other, those fishes or whatever we're trying to protect will feed into other areas or move into other areas. MPAs also protect diverse environments in rapidly changing coastal landscapes. And again, the previous panel alluded to some of this, but these are a couple of scenes from Belize, where I do a lot of my work. One in just north of Placencia, a popular tourist destination, is a large-scale tourist development. The other on the bottom is on the backside of San Pedro on Ambergris Key, another very popular tourist destination. It's very small-scale mangrove destruction, but nonetheless destruction. And I can't actually, sorry. 35% of mangroves worldwide have been lost between 1980 and 2001, so very significant losses. And then also, marine protected areas are important as source areas for commercial species. And here's a shot from Tobacco Key in central Belize on the Barrier Reef. This is a pile of queen conch, and really this little island with a long human history is built on queen conch, literally the foundation. So it's pretty amazing. There's, if not millions, certainly hundreds of thousands of discarded queen conchs that have been harvested. However, even though we can talk about the benefits of marine protected areas, in many areas they're very remote, there's very little budget for enforcement, there's very little staff. Protected areas must generate income, local income, a well-researched topic in the parks and people literature, and this is a very popular theme within geography and wildlife sciences, et cetera. Protected areas, again, has to pay their way in many cases. Particularly in areas around people. I'm sorry, it's just hard to see my text with the lights up here. MPAs also provide critical habitat for iconic sport fish such as tarpon, bonefish, and permit. So I want to expand the definition of iconic species, not just large predatory species or charismatic megafauna, but also species that we value for recreation, for sport. And certainly bonefish, tarpon, and permit fit into that category. Saltwater fly fishing has developed a culture and an economy around these species. Catching all three of these on the same day would be considered getting a grand slam, so sort of incorporating baseball terminology. It's not just a frivolous pastime. This is a growing economy. People spend a lot of money. And this is something that the non-frivolous part is something that has been argued by anglers since Isaac Walton published his tome, The Complete Angler, in 1656. MPAs have become the primary fly fishing grounds or locations in many countries, and we can see this in Cuba that was mentioned by Serge earlier, Belize, Mexico, the Seychelles, et cetera. So MPAs and sport fishing have sort of grown hand in hand. Sport fishing, particularly fly angling, and I argue is an increasingly valuable, minimally consumptive coastal activity. Almost all saltwater fly fishing is catch and release, and I'll talk more about the dynamics of that in just a minute. And this is just a diagram showing the value of outdoor activities. Now, granted, it's a huge number, and sport fishing is a small part of this, and fly fishing is an even smaller part of this. Nonetheless, it is globally in the billions, and it is increasing every year. But outdoor activity, outdoor recreation, is something that really doesn't, I don't think, gets the attention that it should in terms of legislation or just political attention, and it's unfortunate because it is a huge part of the global economy and certainly the national economy. And here's just a few more statistics. This is from a study in the Everglades, and this was a valuation study that looked at sport fishing for a number of species you can see on the left, and the total value of those species at the bottom. It's really quite amazing, and this is for the year 2009, so this is not an accumulation of decades of spending. This is a single year, and again, the Everglades is an important destination for sport anglers, and it is an incredibly important economic activity. And then here's a similar study by the same individual looking at from 2007, so it's a little bit dated, from sport fishing in Belize, and this is one of the baselines that I use in my current work. And again, for a small country like Belize, this is an incredibly large sum of money. And one of the projects I'm working on with a current grad student is Valuation of Permit. It's not a particularly glamorous looking fish. It's not beautiful like a sailfish or menacing like a giant shark or inspiring like a whale. It's a rather nondescript looking member of the jack family. However, it's extremely difficult to catch on a fly rod. So in our valuation study, we found that the permit was actually, each permit landed was valued at over $8,000, each individual fish that was caught. And all fish are released in Belize. Because of that economic value, it's not hard to understand why certain parts of Belize would claim that they are the capital of permit fishing, because Belize is a destination for this obsessive group of anglers, or often obsessive group of anglers. And in this case, Punta Gorda has dubbed themselves the permit capital of Belize. So growing numbers of fly fishing, travel agencies and travel companies have also developed, many linked with conservation planning and conservation donations. So because of this economic value, we're starting to see this spillover in that these travel companies are investing in local conditions, local environmental issues, local political causes, even if it means the sustainable use or sustainable planning of their fisheries resources. And this is Yellow Dog Fly Fishing Company located in Bozeman, Montana. It's a global fly fishing travel agency. And here's just a few of the organizations that they support. Another policy, or a policy result, and Serge mentioned this, the Jardines de la Reina. It's a national park in southern Cuba. The area was named by Christopher Columbus in honor of the Queen of Spain. It's really an amazing coastal ecosystem. It was just declared within the last couple of weeks as a fly fishing only reserve. And so that was, I think, a very symbolic declaration by the Cuban government to recognize the importance of fly fishing in the emerging Cuban sport fishing economy. Also in Belize, as I just mentioned, all three of the Grand Slam species, bonefish, permit, and tarpon, are all catch and release. I've done a lot of market surveys, fisheries market surveys. It's very rare to find one of these species. Most of the people understand their economic value, and as sport fishing has become more popular in Belize and more profitable in Belize, certainly that value has become apparent. Also, development efforts, and here's one example from Costa del Mar, the sunglass company. They produce high-end sunglasses. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with them, but they've created, this isn't saltwater necessarily, but they've created a program in Guyana working with local indigenous people to develop and train people in tourism and in fly fishing. And the target species is the arapina, which is one of the largest freshwater species on the planet and one of the oldest. And it's extremely vulnerable because they surface for air, and so they're easily hunted when it's not regulated. So this is a very interesting sort of byproduct of this growing economic value of sport fishing, particularly fly fishing. Also, guide activism. This is an example from Belize. This is Blacador Key in northern Belize, and one of the plans for this key, this really undeveloped, uninhabited key, was to create a high-end lodge. Much of the, many of the accommodations, or much of the accommodation would be over water. Well, the local Fly Fishing Guides Association has really led the charge to derail this project, because this is an important tarpon, resident tarpon and also migratory tarpon zone. And at last that I've heard is that at least the overwater structures have been struck from the plan, which is good news. And this is from the Orvis newsletter. And Orvis isn't known for its environmental activism, but nonetheless in this case, it sees a cause that it likes. Also, there's some interesting partnerships that are developing between fly fishing guides and researchers, and I'm one of them. And that's through mapping resources. And we've talked a lot about that today already. A number of speakers have mentioned the importance of mapping resources at a very local level. So I've been involved in this in Belize and Cuba as well, working with local guides to identify key fisheries habitat areas, key fishing grounds that perhaps aren't in marine protected areas that should be. And this is a project that I've been working on with a grad student, Brad Bates, and this is one of the posters that he presented at last year's AAG conference. And these are just some of the results using local interviews, local knowledge, but also remote sensing to do some habitat classification. And we're going to continue this work moving forward. So is it sustainable? Well, that's a great question, and that fits the theme of this conference. I think all tourism can be criticized on certain levels, but I do think fly angling in particular is one of the more sustainable, low-impact extractive resource activities. Fly anglings and MPAs is dependent on local knowledge, so power shifts south. You don't fish in Belize, you don't fish in the Bahamas, you don't fish in Cuba without local people. You never fish with an American guide. It's also non-consumptive. All of these countries practice catch and release for almost all the species that people are targeting. Many of the fly fishing lodges are small-scale developments. You don't really see fly fishing lodges at some of the large Cancun-type resorts. It's also high-wage employments. These are highly sought-after positions, guide positions, very middle-class or upper-middle-class incomes in these countries. And then also compatible with high-value extractive species such as conch and lobsters. Not all of these MPAs have complete moratoriums on all extraction, so it can be quite compatible. And then finally, my conclusion, I don't want to take up any more time than I have to. A public-private relationship exists that currently benefits MPA management supported by angling. In a world where more marine territories categorize as MPAs, guides can play a vital role in their protection, especially in areas where marine patrols are minimal due to budget constraints, and that's something our next speaker will talk about. And then also, sport angling has created value and employment through minimally consumptive activities, creating a sustainable example of nature tourism. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here and to speak about my favorite subject on earth, sharks. I am a human geographer by training. I am a professional conservationist by day. I work across the globe on different kinds of shark conservation. Sharks are in trouble. Let me just follow a bit of what my colleagues before have said. I'll tell you the real issue here. Sharks are in trouble. I think as a human geographer who studies the ocean, am I speaking too loudly here? I think as a human geographer who largely has only worked on ocean issues, I think human geographers have also largely ignored the subject. And I think if I could have a call now, it would be that human geographers and other social scientists help normalize our relationship with ocean space. And I understand the complications. Ocean space, sharks are not necessarily part, and in fact in many ways are inaccessible in much of our social process. So I think it's incredibly important that we work to normalize not only our relationship with the oceans, also non-mammals, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but especially the ferocious. Sharks are a group of incredibly diverse creatures, 500 plus species. This is the smallest, the dwarf lanternshark. 7 inches long, eats small things, can't hurt us. If you can imagine, only 22 of these 500 species have ever attacked a human being. All right? So they range in size to the school bus-sized whale shark, and of course the infamous and at times unnecessarily feared great white shark. They are incredibly famous, and as iconic species, we have a bit of an issue. The idea of iconic species largely is an incredibly positive sentiment, I find. And I think in conservation biology, the idea of flagship species, where protecting one species will have down the chain side effects that are positive for the entire ecosystem. But I think what's interesting and what is frustrating as someone who studies the ocean and works in ocean conservation, if we simply look on Google Images at the idea of wildlife, right? Simply type the word wildlife. I did this 2 days ago. Notice they are overwhelmingly, by overwhelmingly I mean all save one, terrestrial species. This is one of the most inherent difficult problems when talking about preserving sharks, conserving sharks in a global system. We have a system where we have not fully accepted sharks as wildlife, and this is coupled with the construct of wilderness. Much of what we protect spatially in wilderness, because we have a legal wilderness in the United States, a codified wilderness. The Wilderness Act, 1964, we create spaces legally that we consider to be wilderness. Of all of the wilderness in the United States, save a few very insignificant exceptions, the Wilderness Act does not protect marine areas. And there are cultural reasons for this. I mean, there is 2,000 years of understanding the wilderness, of course, in a biblical sense, as a desert. So it's naturally hard to understand ocean space as a desert. But it also has to do with the origins of the word. The origins of the word wilderness does come from a Germanic word for deer. So we have had this terrestrial sense about how we construct wilderness. And excluding the ocean has largely informed how we conserve, how we, in this case, preserve ocean spaces. So what do we do when we do preserve ocean? Spaces that house sharks. Because I think marine species, to a greater degree than perhaps terrestrial species, are inextricably connected to their space. And I mean that culturally in how we produce and how we construct who they are, what they are, where they live. With these sorts of spaces, and this isn't a reproach, this is simply just an observation, what we protect globally, and especially historically in the United States, we recreate terrestrial archetypes in the ocean with what we protect. And this is not biological, these are visual archetypes. So we tend to protect coral reefs, right? These are arboreal archetypes, right? They remind us of forests. We tend to protect things that are connected to the surface that some way remind us that we are part of this system. This is the USS Monitor, it's a national marine sanctuary. So we protect surface craft, we protect arboreal archetypes. These are things that remind us that we're part of the system. I think we often forget when we're talking about the ocean is, in fact, a toxic environment for humans, right? We can't breathe, we cannot abide, we're cold, it's dark, it's scary, we can't stay. I think part of being able to protect space and in turn these marine species, we have to be able to imagine inhabitation. And I think that's part of the reason why we've had trouble effectively managing marine species. And part of it is too, how do we interact with sharks? Most people, granted, I am an adult who has the great luck of being able to talk about sharks and interact with shark science every day. Much to I can imagine my mother when I was a 4-year-old doing the same thing. Now at least I have professional license to do it. But how do we interact with sharks? I'm from Florida. I've been to the beach, 1,000 times in my life. I've always lived within a mile of the beach. I have seen this image maybe 3 times. Right? This is an incredibly rare and important occasion for us to interact with sharks. But it doesn't really happen. Fishing, of course. There are only 3 million Americans who are certified to scuba dive. right? So it is also a rare occasion. We've had scuba diving since 1943, right? Jacques Cousteau invents it with Émile Gagnon. Very few people interact. And how about if you're also in public supermarket, if you know the Southeast and Florida especially, this is the supermarket, there are shark steaks. This is one way in which we interact with sharks, but we don't realize we're interacting with. For instance, who eats swordfish? Okay? Well, if you've eaten a swordfish, and you likely have purchased a swordfish from the Canadian swordfish industry, for every one swordfish caught, you have accidentally caught 4 blue sharks. So you're constantly interacting with sharks, whether or not you realize you're doing so. And I think part of this is, with this odd construct we have with sharks, is we have trouble even linguistically engaging sharks. You can imagine linguistically, because before I became a geographer, I was a linguist, when a word is more specific, it's something we assign more value with, something we use more frequently, or something we have greater interaction with. If you can pay attention here to the shark column, everything requires an adjective, and almost everything is terrestrial in nature. Blue shark, bull shark, carpet shark, cat shark, copper shark, crocodile shark, dogfish. If you compare that to the bony fish we eat, anchovy, carp, cod, eel, grouper, a grouper's a grouper, an eel's an eel, right? Same with birds, cormorant, crow, duck, eagle. So we have an uneasiness because it's not part of our normal systems. Well, what does this mean for conservation? As I said, sharks are in trouble. 100 million sharks are killed a year, and that is a very conservative estimate. Of that, 80 million a year are killed for their fins alone, about 20 million for their meat. Why do we care about fins? Well, it really wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s, as East Asia becomes increasingly wealthy, because shark fin soup, which is the main reason why shark fin is a market at all, exists since the Ming Dynasty. So it's an old dish. It simply was for banquets and weddings. It was meant to show your power, your wealth. That continues today. So if you can imagine, weddings, largely in China, mostly in southern China, and northern Vietnam, account for the death of 80 million sharks a year. The crazy part is, for me, these fins go through 7 chemical processes. By the end, they are flavorless, and you're simply harvesting them for these small fibers, what are called serratitrichia. And the serratitrichia simply make the soup gelatinous. So you can have chicken-flavored shark fin soup. You can have fish flavor. You can have vegetable flavor. So it's simply a way, and this isn't, I understand that is slightly culturally insensitive, but the reality is that this cultural process, this cultural practice, is in fact leading to the extinction of an entire group of marine creatures. It's a humongous market worth billions of dollars. 2 kilograms of quality, 1 kilogram rather, of quality fins can be upwards of 600 euros. So they're incredibly valuable, only more valuable in nature products, possibly by ivory, especially rhino ivory. So I think most people are surprised to learn that Spain is in fact the largest exporter of shark fins in the world. We do as well export, and of course many other countries. I think, why does it matter? Sharks are apex predators. They keep balance within their ecosystems. They reproduce incredibly slowly. If you look at the big eye thresher, they have pups. They're much more similar to bears and other mammals than they are to bony fish. If you can imagine, swordfish produce millions of eggs 3 times a year. A thresher shark has 2 to 4 pups once a year. So they're incredibly slow to mature. They produce very few young. 54% of chondrichthyes, and chondrichthyes are sharks, rays, and chimeras, and this is a chimera, deep water, small sharkish creature, are threatened with extinction. This is an alarming number. There's a couple of ways to go about fixing this problem. One is preservation, very much in a John Muir sense, where you're preserving something for its inherent value, right? This is preservation on the shark front. This is spatial only because it represents the entire exclusive economic zone of all of these nations. There are 14 nations who have completely banned commercial shark fishing. This is preservation. It is often an unpopular method for some NGOs, certain countries. Each of these countries celebrate this. It is an incredibly valuable tourism tool, especially for the Bahamas. $113 million a year just in shark tourism, not including fishing. And another option is conservation, and this is using mechanisms like the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, regional fisheries management organizations, and this is where we can promote sustainable fisheries for those commercially viable species. Just last month, we were able to help push through 9 species of Mambula rays, 3 species of thresher shark, and the silky shark. And I just want to go through this just quite quickly, just so you have a very brief idea of how culture, in fact, directly affects, and has directly affected conservation, especially here in the United States, because that's the example I use. This is Watson and the Shark, hangs in the National Gallery. 1778 recounts a story in Havana in 1749 of this young man, Watson, being eaten by a shark. This was the first experience of nationwide fear of sharks. Jump ahead a few centuries, 1916, the Jersey Maneater. This series of shark attacks up and down the Jersey coast over 4th of July, after 4th of July, busy weekend. President Wilson declares war on sharks. He has the Coast Guard and the Navy indiscriminately killing sharks up and down the coast. This is obviously fear in its worst manifestation. Of course, everyone recognizes the panic in Roy's face. 1974, 1975, possibly the most damaging year for fear of sharks. Because 1974, Peter Benchley writes his novel. Before it's even published, Steven Spielberg buys the film rights. And it was the first summer blockbuster. It was the first nationwide release of any movie. So you can imagine the effect of the movie Jaws on conservation of sharks and fear of sharks. Simultaneously, Jacques Cousteau's Undersea World was also playing on TV. So all the good that Jacques Cousteau was doing in our living rooms was undone by this movie. Fear continues, and the last 4, and then I'm done, are concurrent. Fear continues, and fear is a problem, culturally, with sharks. And I understand. They are incredibly scary creatures when you're in the water with them, if you don't want to be near one. But don't forget, every time you've ever been in the beach, in the ocean, you have been in the water with a shark, and it is the largest wilderness in the world. Fear continues. Sensationalism about shark attacks. 6 people died last year of sharks. In the entire world, 6 people died. More than that were attacked, but 6 people died. You're more likely to die of toilet injury, which is actually accurate, than a shark attack. So this, concurrently with fear, is also the concern about the plight of sharks. This is new. This is new. We find throughout the globe there is a concern about the plight, and this is one of the first steps. But also we see this uptick in fear and in fascination and admiration. Shark tourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it grows every year. And I think possibly the most hopeful bit, because I wanted to end on something hopeful, because I realize conservation can be a bit difficult. Care. This is the first time I've ever seen such a scene, and this was 2015, Cape Cod. This is reminiscent of how we treated whales, right? We've been doing this with pilot whales and dolphins and large whales for 100 years. But for the first time, possibly not the first time, but a great example, look at all of these people. They dug a trench. They're pouring water over its gills. They're doing everything they can to save this shark's life. And I think this is the tipping point. This is honestly the start of a new paradigm in both how we view ocean conservation, but how we view predators in the ocean as well, which is incredibly important. But don't get me wrong. We still have a long way to go. And there were 3 of these movies. Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me here today. Really excited to have a chance to chat with you all about something that I have been very passionate about, sort of spent my academic career focused on, and now I have the good fortune to be working with the geographer of the United States, Lee Schwartz, and very happy to be here today. So thank you for the invitation. For those of you that have an electronic device, you may want to Google this particular iconic species, but please turn your volume off because they have the most amazing, I guess I'll call it a song. I don't know if anyone's ever heard an Indri. Has anyone? So it's cool. It's very interesting. And these guys are the largest living species of lemur in Madagascar. So they can definitely classify as being iconic. And so before humans hunted them to extinction, lemurs used to be, or so the giant lemurs used to be upwards of 350 pounds. And so just wanted to give all of you with an electronic device something to do here. So I'm going to talk about wildlife trafficking and iconic species. And as Dr. Popper mentioned, I am currently in the U.S. State Department, so this would be my opportunity to acknowledge that what I'm going to talk about today is only my opinion, and I'm not representing any opinions of the U.S. government. So what I am going to focus on are animals and places that we probably all know about and are facing global ramifications from crime. I'm going to propose to you in the next couple of minutes that one of the ways that we can collaborate and move towards a sustainable kind of situation for some of these species is to focus on preventing kind of the deviant human behavior that a lot of us have been kind of talking about here today. So crime prevention, as opposed to responding to crime, is one way that we can work towards sustainability, or one of the kind of themes here of our event over the next 2 days. So human-wildlife relationships, as we've all kind of seen through, and I guess it's great that I'm going at the end because there's a whole, as we can see, a whole suite of ways that humans and wildlife interact. And our relationships are complex, they're dynamic, and they vary according to time and space. And so, you know, people interact with wildlife for food, for recreational purposes. Some people leverage wildlife resources for medicine, cultural traditions, like life cycle events, revenue. This lady paid money for an ecotourism experience with lemurs. Retaliation. Sometimes wildlife depredates livestock, and so we retaliate. We you know, lethally control wildlife. And then also entertainment. We have circuses. Some people use wildlife as shooting practice in certain contexts. So, you know, our relationships with wildlife are very diverse and are very complicated. One of the human-wildlife relationships that I think are really noteworthy here is wildlife trafficking. Wildlife trafficking poses risks to humans, wildlife, and the environment writ large. So to wildlife, we're talking about extinction. So, you know, the giant lemurs are an example of a wildlife species that's been hunted to extinction. There's many others. We've heard about sharks that are being kind of exploited, often in an illegal context. So the risk that we're talking about when we focus on wildlife is a risk of extinction or local extirpation. There's also risks to humans. So when you're dealing with wildlife trafficking, you have corruption, you have transnational organized crime. We also have instances where rangers who are employed to protect wildlife are actually shot in the line of duty. And so the risks to human from wildlife trafficking are multifaceted as well. And then the environment. We've heard a little bit about ecosystem services, but when you remove species from environments or ecosystems, it has a consequential impact on the entire food web. And of course, I'm going to focus on wildlife, but this entire context translates over to fish as well. So I want to give a shout out to the aquatic species. So we have evidence of wildlife trafficking, the risks associated with wildlife trafficking in a global context. This is not an issue that is geographically bound, spatially bound, temporally bound. And we know that wildlife trafficking undermines our sustainable development investments. It fuels social conflict. There are connections to transnational organized crime and non-state small armed groups. And it also is motivated by a whole variety of human sort of psychoses, I guess, if you will. Sometimes wildlife is exploited for, or trafficked for pocketbook-related reasons. So people are trying to earn a buck, they're trying to contribute economically to their livelihood, or they're maybe just trying to derive some sort of protein, you know, a cooking pot kind of motivation. One thing that I think is really noteworthy is that wildlife-related crime is now estimated to be the 4th largest global illicit trade, behind like arms and drugs, and maybe timber. So it's up there, and it's removing billions of dollars from our global economy on an annual basis. It's a big problem, it's global, and now I'm going to get a little bit more depressing. So, reason for hope. Okay, so, so one of the ways, so if you're going to buy this idea that we can kind of work to prevent crime, you might think about doing that in a holistic way. One of the ways that we can bring multiple perspectives to the table would be to think about integrating principles and practices from criminology and criminal justice, right? These are the guys that excel at crime and crime control. Risk and decision science. Why do humans behave the way that they do? No comment. Natural resource management, conservation biology, biogeochemistry, environmental processes. When you merge all of these disciplines and principles together, we have sustainable outcomes, right? We have improved environmental resilience, we have conservation of biodiversity, and we also have human benefits, right? We have more secure livelihoods. So this is kind of one way that you can go about taking a holistic approach to trying to prevent some of these risks associated with wildlife crime, with wildlife trafficking. I call this conservation criminology. You can just call it, well, you can call it a duck if you like, but really what it represents is kind of an operationalization of what Chris was talking about earlier, this holistic, sustainable, kind of proactive approach. So one of the ways that you can think about doing this, this kind of holistic prevention of wildlife trafficking, is to think about focusing on targeting the crime and not criminals. So crime prevention can occur either by trying to affect the dispositions of an offender or trying to reduce opportunities for the crime to be committed. And this is where I think there's a really amazing synergy with the broader field of geography. Because what criminologists tell us is that crime is an opportunity that's simply created when you have an overlap of a motivated offender with a lack of guardianship and a suitable target. And so, you know, I have an African wild dog here in the picture, but it could be a shark, it could be elephants, it could be, a wolf in Michigan. I mean, it could be anywhere. And when you have the overlap of these three phenomena in space and time, you have a crime. And so the kind of shining light that this simple Venn diagram offers us is all you need to do is break the chain somehow. So there's multiple entry points to try to resolve the opportunity for a crime. And so what I would like to do is enter the maps, right? And so these are hot off the press. So I think we were just released yesterday, actually. And so a series of 3 maps illustrating kind of a synergistic way to thinking about preventing wildlife trafficking in a region of the world that has seen extremely high rates of wildlife trafficking. So African forest elephant populations have decreased upwards of 60 to 65% in the past decade. And overwhelmingly, this population decrease is simply for ivory, which is being exported from the continent of Africa. And so in the tri-border region of Central Africa, where you have the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Central African Republic, you have a nice assemblage of protected areas and a very large forest elephant range. And so in many of these ecosystems are still intact. So elephants could do well here, and in fact have done well. And unfortunately, when you have human and wildlife populations that spatially and temporally overlap, you have a flashpoint for conflict that can be created. That flashpoint for human-wildlife conflict overlaps human-human conflict in this neck of the woods. And so this is a I guess, I don't know what the technical term for this map is. Map. Well, so anyway, my PhD is in natural resource policy and management. I guess that little bit has emerged. So what you can see here, there's human-human conflict. There are small non-state armed groups that are engaging in all sorts of conflicts in this region, and they're completely spatially overlapping with wildlife. And indeed, they're exploiting, a lot of the times these conflicts result in exploitation of elephants and their ivory. And so what we know from a host of different actors that are really very committed to collecting data on the ground is you have a very active wildlife trafficking system or supply chain here that focuses around Garumba National Park, which is kind of on the eastern side of the map. We also have transhumance, which is cattle herding. And so you have massive amounts of, or increasing numbers of cattle that are migrating south. Increasingly, their southerly movements are increasingly influenced by climate change and drought. And so you have just a real kind of overlap of a whole suite of opportunities for crime. We have motivated offenders in the form of these bad actors from the armed groups. We have a suitable target, ivory, and we have a lack of guardianship. There's so much geopolitical conflict in this area that a lot of the times the authorities or other guardians are just simply unable to respond. So that was dismal. So what are some opportunities for crime prevention? So if you buy these kind of opportunity theories of crime, then we can work to break that kind of kick one leg out of the three-legged stool, if you will. You can work to increase the efforts associated with crime, increase the risks of crime, reduce rewards, reduce provocations, remove excuses. For anyone that's been to a sporting event in the last decade, you have probably been the beneficiary of these crime prevention techniques. Certainly after 9/11, these types of situational crime prevention techniques have been implemented when you have massive amounts of people coming together. And so there are really discrete activities that criminologists tell us we can take to reduce these opportunities for crime. And so there's a real opportunity, I think, to engage in crime prevention activities in addition to these reactive activities, which are often law enforcement responding after they get a call, essentially. And so we, my students and myself, are kind of all over the world working to build the knowledge base about how these situational crime prevention techniques work. And the good news is that at a very local level, there's an opportunity to influence in a positive way. Rhino poaching in Sumatra, pangolin poaching in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This would be on the west coast, not in the east. Sea turtles in Nicaragua, otters and marten in Michigan, and lemurs in Madagascar. And so I guess with that, I will just say thank you for your time, and now maybe we can collectively as a group answer some questions from the audience. Thanks.
So the framework that you put together, Meredith, on the lack of guardianship, the
Motivated offender,
and the target, basically. Could we go across the panel and just apply that framework? Could you apply it to sharks? Could you apply it to buffalo? I mean, because I buy it. I mean, you kind of said, if anybody buys this theory, I buy that theory. Could you kind of apply that framework and kind of introduce what that would mean for different species?
So one of the,
Ryan can do it. Anybody you want. Anybody.
So I guess a really good example would be, and I'll just say that a great way to apply the framework is using maps. So we do, community mapping to often delineate these opportunity structures spatially and temporally. So you can use a variety of scientific and technical expertise to map the geographic distribution of elephants across, forest elephants across a forested range, for example, in Congo. And there are wildlife biologists who know the obligate requirements for an African forest elephant to be in a particular area. And then you also have guardianship. So we could think about guardianship in a very traditional way, like police, but a lot of the times you have conservation organizations or protected areas. You even have kind of very decentralized community governance structures. So interpret the term guardianship very liberally. Anyone could be a guardian, right? Think about like the gruff take a bite out of crime, you know, like your neighbor could be a guardian, right? And then you have to have a motivated offender. And so criminologists offer, right, and so they would say that there are some people who are biologically wired to engage in a criminal behavior, but then there are others who have, you know, there's structural disadvantage theories of why people might be motivated. But then, you know, you never know why I might, you know, engage. I mean, why do you speed? Why do you not, you know, floss your teeth? Why do you not, you know, wear your seatbelt sometimes? So those are maybe normative, well, speeding, no, but you know, why does anyone kind of become motivated to commit an offense? So you look at the spatial temporal overlap of those phenomenon, and then you can actually spatially see where there's an entry point for intervention. The situational crime prevention techniques then say, okay, well, how do you increase the risks? How do you make it harder for a motivated offender to gain access? So for us, you know, like here at, say, a sporting event, you lock some of the doors, right? So there's only one exit point. So we all have to go through there so a guardian can watch us, that kind of thing. So that would be a long answer to your question.
Great. The ocean is so amazingly large that complete enforcement is an impossibility. And we have some hope in the form of satellite monitoring. Also, all commercial fishing vessels are equipped with VMS, it's called, and they have to be tracked. Certain countries require any fishing in those nations to be tracked, but also there are really exciting international agreements that were just signed into force, like the Port State Measures Agreement, which really puts a lot of the onus on the importing country, and then CITES, which really does both, puts onus on the importing and exporting nations. So, for instance, with CITES, with these species that were just listed, a country is only allowed to export fins or any other part of these animals if they can prove it's sustainably traded. And so then that permit then arrives. It's called an NDF if they're trading, a non-detriment finding. It's then imported to Hong Kong in this case, and the government of Hong Kong is incredibly receptive and helpful in this process. And they'll just say, no, we're not taking these fins from Panama because Panama has not proven that this species of shark is in fact sustainably harvested. Some of the Panama I use as an example, I mean, they're trying hard, but it's almost exclusively a lack of funds to enforce these issues. So there are countries who work together, OSPESCO, which is the fishing group for all of Central America and Dominican Republic. They try to work together to enforce these things. The motivation is completely money. I mean, Costa Rica, this is going to burst a lot of your bubbles because Costa Rica, I think, is kind of hailed as this amazing green nation. Let me assure you, it is the least blue nation in this hemisphere. Everything that Costa Rica can do to ensure that sharks are unsustainably harvested does do. So it was a bit of a wake-up call, including falsifying permits for exportation. So it has to be pressure from international communities. There has to be, in fact, interaction. CITES has teeth as a convention. So Hong Kong can absolutely say, no, we don't want your unsustainable fins. It's completely monetarily based. And most of this fishing occurs in Central America, especially, I keep using this, on the commercial level. There are plenty of artisanal fishermen who consume and export the fins, but the large commercial fleets are, in fact, just hunting for the fins.
Let me just say briefly, I think that this is a really great opportunity for geographers, though, because to understand and enforce these laws and to stop illegal harvest or illegal fishing or whatever it is, you have to know where it is, right? And that's something that geographers have done for a long time, mapping territory, mapping resources. Peter Hurley, he's in the office, or in the room. Bernard Nietzschman did this on the Nicaraguan coast. So this is a real strength of our discipline, where we can play a really positive role in the enforcement end of wildlife trafficking.
And to respond also to your question, for buffalo, it's a very different set of considerations, because while they are in fact wildlife, they're not treated as wildlife. So, in fact, they are entirely supposed to be under guardianship, and if they want to behave freely, they are then committing crimes. So if in many cases, when I said that if they leave Yellowstone, then they are then the criminal and committing the crime in some of the states. So the notion, I suppose, that we need to also interrogate a little bit is that notion of what's wild and what's not wild, and what are, again, I started with whether the relationships between us and them, are we supposed to always be their guardians, or do they have independent will? And sharks obviously do, but those on land, and certainly in this country, in our country, which is much more controlled, or the space is controlled, that becomes a different set of questions.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I really like, I just want to say that this framework sounds really interesting, but I guess I have to ask the question that the more we clamp down as societies and cultures on these things, then we're creating something that's maybe more rare or harder to get, and then are we not raising demand for it, which then is going to motivate more offenders. So at what point in time do we actually address the culture? Because I see this working from the bottom up, but the demand is still there. You know, we don't have a drug problem along the US-Mexican border. I mean, if the United States doesn't have an appetite for drugs.
So the U.S. has a strategy to combat wildlife trafficking, and law enforcement or crime prevention would just be one of the three approaches. I don't know if that's you.
It's me, and I don't know what I'm doing to it.
Demand reduction is really important, and so that's where oftentimes like social marketers, public relations, communication experts get involved in the dialogue. There's also a role for foreign diplomacy and foreign relations. So, you know, Ryan, you spoke a little bit about CITES and other kind of bilateral or, you know, international conventions. And then this kind of law enforcement plus, you know, where you could have proactive or preventative and reactive law enforcement strategies. So that's the approach that the United States is currently taking to combat wildlife trafficking, and variations of those kind of three approaches are being taken by other actors like the UK, and even being replicated in some African nations.
This is, Meredith would probably know this much better, but I was just recently reading about this in reference to CITES. There are these two different, there's this African Elephant Coalition, and it's very much geographically divided between SADC, which is the southern African nations from the DRC down, including the Seychelles, and then effectively the whole of North Africa. Well, the belief, especially Kenya, who is the chair currently of the African Elephant Coalition, is that in fact the one-off sale, which was when elephants were listed in certain populations from Appendix 1 in CITES to Appendix 2, there was this large sale of ivory for this very belief that in fact that this it's already exists, the animal's already dead, let's sell it. Many, and not everyone agrees with this statement, but many NGOs and many researchers believe that in fact, because of the flood, because all of a sudden there was all this ivory, that it completely opened up a market that may never have existed. So it's a slippery slope, and it exists with shark fins as well. And it's kind of like ivory burners, shark fin burners. I mean, Honduras, for instance, just had a shark fin burn. So
Can I just add one thing? If you think about wildlife the same way that a cop thinks about like stereo, like if you think about auto theft or somebody breaking into your home to steal a television, you know, whoa, what was my thought? I'm sorry. The idea, it's gone. I'm really sorry.
Somebody else asked a question.
no, not at all. Come on.
There were more questions after, yeah.
Keep about stereos.
Demand only goes so far, right? Like, do you think that police try to reduce demand for stereos in an urban environment? You know, I think the idea is that you reduce the opportunity structure for crime, right? So you prevent the stereo from ever being stolen. You prevent the elephant from ever being killed. That's all at the very beginning of the crime cycle, right? Demand is at the end, right? So this is targeting the supply side. And I'm sorry about that brain void thing.
I had a question. I'm from Florida, where we recently had about a year ago, we had a bear hunt that took place after they had the bears protected for years and years and years and years because there weren't enough bears. So then they decided, well, we've done such a good job protecting them, let's go hunt them. What would you guys say in response to that? Because that's, again, taking away a top-level predator because it's affecting people's homes. You know, I mean, where do we find a balance in this with people live places and they want to get rid of the bears?
I think this is something I think you'll answer beautifully, but I think that's as old as wildlife as conflict. I, too, am a Floridian. I'd like to blame Rick Scott, but I don't know that that's the answer you're looking for. But in fact, no, I actually think there was no scientific justification for that particular case. And I think interaction with sharks, I'll use the shark example. Granted, we don't live there, but if you look at netting procedures around the world, South Africa, Australia, culling programs, we have the hubris as humans to believe that we don't need to share these wildernesses. And I think that is a prime example of a long and painful history. But maybe others as well.
So black bears are not endangered in the United States. They're currently found in 40 of the lower 48, and their populations are doing really well at a country level. And so this is a good question for geographers to answer. What's the spatial appropriateness of sustainability? Does it matter if bears go extinct in the state of Florida if they're not extinct in the country? Like, what's the spatial standard for sustainability? So,
Florida's ground zero for human-wildlife conflicts because the growth rate right there, exceeds most developing countries. So it's something that's not going to go away anytime soon. I'm not sure if there was science behind the planned hunt. I don't think there was from what I read. But it's again, it's just ground zero for these kind of conflicts.
Let's get another question, I think, rather than my getting into a whole other way of thinking about this. I think that'd be better. And I think, or John, are you telling us enough? Okay. Come talk to us afterwards. Thank you.